The availability of information and multimedia in the modern age has presented filmmakers, fans, critics, and scholars with an ever-growing bounty of understated or previously forgotten moments and movements in cinematic history. Whether it's a recent rediscovery of a lost silent era film, or a re-evaluation of somebody's body of work via contemporary perspectives, we are more equipped than we've ever been to evaluate and better contextualize what has been accomplished and how it affected the current state of artistic and commercial multimedia. Cinema can be considered the most diverse, multidisciplinary art form that humanity has yet created, a combination of nearly every form of human expression which came before it, which has continued to evolve alongside technological improvements and platform innovations. The toys and gadgets might keep changing, but the central tenets remain the same. But what about video, cinema's younger sibling? Well, for that, we have history to explore. The Betamax and VHS recording formats were conceived and brought to the public in 1975 and 1976 respectively, and were initially seen as everything from an overly expensive novelty with a short shelf life to a possible harbinger of doom for the art of film itself. While television had long ballooned into a massive industry by the 1970s, in the eyes of Western film studios and critics, it was considered second-tier entertainment, a sentiment that some niches have kept alive all the way to the present day. And when videotape came on the scene, it was determined by some as a mutation of this existing lower class of storytelling. Its utility was primarily as a time-shifting device so we could record television programs to watch at a later time. But when videotape overcame its first marketing hurdles, its financial reliance on the pornography industry, and a few key legal troubles, with the near-decade-long Betamax case between Sony and Universal being taken all the way to the United States Supreme Court, the industry and the use of the format exploded in North America. Corporate film studios started consistently releasing butchered pan-and-scan nightmares of their theatrically released films, and were raking in more profits from the home release of their movies than the works had earned through their entire theatrical run. But these same materials and technologies which allowed large studios to maximize their profits on a popular movie, past or present, also directly helped to start the DIY filmmaking boom of the late 80s, which extended all the way into the early aughts. These works were often micro-budget genre movies that existed in a weird place between sleaze and cheese, and catered to that specific kind of audience who would fill midnight screenings and tune into blocks of public access horror flicks. But this evolution was not even comparable when looking at Japan. Videotapes and video production wasn't seen as a leech, but promoted as a natural progression of film distribution, with several major studios spearheading the adoption of video production divisions as early as 1969. Sure, the majority of the earliest video releases by companies large and small were split between professional training videos, called industrials, and erotica, informally known as pink film. But we'll get more into that in a minute. As the 1980s got into its stride, massive economic growth encouraged brands to invest more into video, which also birthed the unique release methods for this content. Toho opened the world's first 2 video rental stores in 1977, and from 1982 through 1984, Kadokawa started premiering films in theaters on the same day that they were available for purchase on tape. Though these initial efforts consisted of more stumbles than steady footwork in attempts to secure customers, the amorphous use and reach greatly influenced video's tone and content. This subsequently coaxed in more creators and producers than just those making corporate industrials and porn. Well, mostly. It would also foster the OVA. In their nascent stages, original video animations were, more often than not, rejected anime pilots or series that didn't quite make the cut to appear on Japanese television. Instead of just forfeiting the production costs that went into creating these products, videocassettes allowed for their release directly to the public. Sure, initial efforts were generally so disorganized, it wasn't uncommon for episodes to be released out of their intended order, with each print run of tapes offering wild swings in quality. This rough and tumble landscape immediately started affecting the creation of things, and mere weeks after the first OVA was publicly released by Bandai, the smutsters were hard at work, sprinting to smack as much sleaze onto video as possible. The result was Wonder Kid's pornographic OVA series, Lolita, the first reported example of the hentai subgenre. As the 80s drew to a close, hundreds of millions of videotapes were being sold each year. OVA productions accounted for over half of all anime purchased in Japan, and the profits garnered from the video industry eclipsed the theaters several times over. Video grew from an overpriced novelty niche to considerable dominance over the entertainment space in less than 10 years. And during this zenith of media saturation, the story of what eventually would be called V-Cinema began, starting with a studio executive and his battle against the fast-forward button. While Toei's first foray into video rental stores had fizzled out in the first half of the decade, by 1989, the company's efforts had helped shape the overall video market and had money pouring in. But conversely, the average price to license external media for distribution had risen so steeply that several video distributors were weighing these costs against creating their own original content. Enter Toei Video and the film franchise Battles Without Honor and Humanity. While this film franchise detailing the historic rise of the Yakuza continued releasing installments into the early 2000s, the original pentalogy of movies, released in the early 70s, had won both acclaim and commercial success, and was an obvious choice to get a home release. And when the series hit the market between 1987 and 1988, a producer with Toei Video, Tetsuya Yoshida, found out a critical element about their audience. They weren't watching the movies. Well, kinda. It has been claimed that during this time, Yoshida would frequent video rental stores to canvass opinions and viewing habits of Toei's customers. While doing so, he found out that fans would rent all 5 of these movies at once and utilize their VCRs to jump through them in order to just watch the exciting bits, much like I'm doing with my clip selection right now. While time shifting had always been billed as a major attraction of VCRs and videotape, this information gave Yoshida insight into how this new medium had fundamentally altered their audience. Armed with this understanding, Yoshida returned to his bosses at Toei with the determination to produce movies whose entertainment factor was so undeniable that they wouldn't be skipped through. Whether the movie was conventionally good or bad was seemingly irrelevant. The audience's primary concern was entertainment. So it was up to the producers to understand how to modify their typical approaches to exploitation in order to keep this new generation consuming. Sure, this mentality is arguably as old as movie making itself, with people screening sinful celluloid as early as the silent film era. Every decade has given birth to a new generation of shock artists and exploiteers who peddle their smut with highly incendiary marketing techniques in order to get asses into seats.
You must keep reminding yourself, it's just a movie. It's just a movie. It's just a movie.
While this combination has been present in every international region that has access to movie cameras and theaters, this is how the American, Filipino, and Australian exploitation markets had thrived for decades, especially during the golden age of drive-in movie theaters and urban grindhouses from the late 50s into the early 80s. When 1989 had rolled around, there still existed a worldwide exploitation film market with a significant presence in Japan, but it was still a shadow of its former self. And while many were working to resurrect the golden years of silver screen sensationalism, few contemporaries other than Yoshida and his collaborators seemed to understand the ingredients necessary to kickstart a modern exploitation boom. And the immediate fruit of this labor arrived in March 1989 in the form of the 60-minute action film Crime Hunter. Built around a ramshackled revenge plot sprinting through shootouts, car chases, and a gun-wielding nun, Crime Hunter was engineered from top to bottom to herald Toei's new direct-to-video design philosophies. It brims with every exploitable 80s action cliché that you'd expect from any Sylvester Stallone vehicle from around this time, which is exactly what Yoshida intended. Without much of a pesky story to hold it back, Crime Hunter's frenetic chaos struck an immediate nerve with Japan's growing videophiles, successfully kicking off Toei's official V-Cinema product line. It was followed up mere months later by a sequel, starring American actor Eric Douglas as one of the film's antagonists, and the assassin-themed thriller The Shootist, a cleverly choreographed movie whose soundtrack of smoking lounge jazz and 80s synth might just be one of the more unique soundscapes from any movie released during this era. As Toei entered 1990, they started releasing between 1 and 3 V-Cinema productions on almost a monthly basis. These videos were often pre-sold to rental stores based solely on their genres, titles, or promotional material, many times before the movies had even been filmed. This insane rate and method of release ensured that the low cost of the films never presented a major risk for the studio, simultaneously allowing Toei to stay in step with the ever-shifting demands of the fanbase. But this approach also forcibly compounded the timeline of these productions, with some filmmakers having only a matter of weeks to bring a film from planning to print, a detail that would become increasingly oppressive as the years continued. But the immediate result of this sausage factory mentality was Toei leading the video industry in best-selling releases. It was so successful that over 20% of Toei's total yearly income was coming from videotape sales and rentals. The well-publicized success of the V-Cinema line immediately broke the dam, and a storm surge of copycat video producers and distributors flooded the market. These early content mills ranged from the video departments of major studios, tiny startups with barely a pocketful of resources, and fronts for organized crime. With roughly 200 films being produced in a year, it almost seemed as if anyone with a blood squib and a camcorder had access to their own money printer. That was until Japan's financial bubble burst, leading to an economic meltdown so severe, the succeeding years would become known in some circles as Japan's lost decade. Of course, when investment stopped, many of these overnight imitation V-Cinema producers evaporated. This ended up being a bit of a blessing in disguise for Toei. They not only had some capital to continue investing in V-Cinema projects, but had already outlived the early bulk of the industry bloat which they had indirectly fostered. But that wasn't to say that they just continued producing low-grade action flicks with no diversification or innovation, as there were several other major studios weathering the economic crisis, in part to producing their own variations on V-Cinema, with little to no attempt to disguise it. So, the Toei V-Cinema brand needed a more convincing hook than just catering to the time-shifting mechanics of a VCR. While their initial efforts at this diversification would pay off, it would also come at a cost. The 1990s saw media companies issuing a non-stop yearly avalanche of direct-to-video productions. But to match the demands of the audience, as well as stay somewhat relevant, V-Cinema makers had to apply new gimmicks and explore new genres to keep people renting. Action films gave way to comedies, erotica, horror, and gambling narratives. Not that these weren't being produced for film and video before this point, but the financial turbulence in Japan was forcing studios and creators to adopt a kitchen sink mentality, flailing around wildly to see what would stick with people, and then milking that appeal until every drop of novelty was wrung dry. To this end, V-Cinema distributors were getting more nervy while manipulating exploitable elements of their films, namely their stars. While earlier V-Cinema entries saw fairly equal treatment of their male and female actors on screen, depending on the subject matter, the turn of the decade saw considerably more women being unceremoniously turned into sex icons, even if the movies in question weren't necessarily supposed to be sexy. Distributors would release nude photo books of the main actresses along with the videotapes, which would effectively restrict their careers. Whether they were budding starlets or were older stars who had lost their luster in adjacent careers, such as pop idols and fashion icons, many would find that acting in one V-Cinema production would essentially confine their future work to more of the same, starring in various V-Cinema, pink film, or pornographic releases, with little to no hope of ever breaking into any other form of mainstream film or television acting. The same can't be said for many of their on-screen male counterparts, or for the creators working behind the camera, who stepped into and out of V-cinema with considerably more ease. This would only get worse as the decade continued, with many companies, especially Toei, relying heavily on erotica to pay the freight. While this overwhelming increase in sleaze wasn't enough to hammer death nails into the industry, or just relegate it to the corner with their pornographic cousins, massive changes in home video consumption were forcing V-cinema executives to make hard decisions. By 1994, video rental stores in Japan had been cut in half, and video renting in general was becoming more consolidated under the direction of Tsutaya, a corporate chain of video rental shops and bookstores. The localized connection that Yoshida had cultivated to construct the V-cinema market was shrinking month by month, and there was little anyone could do to combat it. This reduction in accessibility, compounded by the incessant pressures of Japan's sustained economic crisis, forced V-cinema creators and producers to abandon their traditional methods of shooting their movies. While many had originally shot their works on 16mm film before converting them into VHS to be sold, video was now becoming both the method of release and production. Starting roughly in the mid-90s, it's as if they had taken a decade-long backstep into the shoes of Western indies, and the overall audio-visual quality of V-cinema offerings started reflecting this harshly. While many early entries into the V-cinema landscape had encouraged strong word-of-mouth interest to match their ridiculous marketing schemes, by the late 1990s, even the most ardent fans of the medium were becoming fatigued and disinterested. In the eyes of many, they were no longer receiving that subversive and exciting material which challenged the typical narrative form and exemplified the possibilities of the video format. The market was now overflooded with products that were seemingly more derivative and lazy than the last. Numbered series of movies were released relentlessly, partially because many of these movie franchises were shot simultaneously, whittling down the original weeks that crews had for production to mere days. By the time that the year 2000 had swung around, the V-cinema industry had birthed over 3,000 titles since 1989, with most coming and going without much more than a whisper. While some dedicated makers had tried to initiate paradigm shifts in the industry by introducing elements like international co-productions with the United States, resulting in Toei's V America imprint in 1992, which produced some truly zany multinational movie experiences, these experiments were short-lived and had relatively low impact on the trajectory of V-cinema. Though it is fun to see the likes of Viggo Mortensen and Russell Crowe doing their damnedest to act within the V-cinema framework in the years prior to them getting Hollywood famous. But while these changes did have a negative impact on V-cinema, it wasn't the end. In fact, while the bulk of the 1990s saw V-cinema tumbling further out of favor with audiences, with virtually any form of academic or critical discourse of the movement being shunted into the nearest available gutter, that isn't to claim that there was no dramatic innovation during these years. Several films and videos released during this period would eventually form the foundation for the most recognizable aspects of V-cinema in the present day. Unlike many major film movements of the past, like German Expressionism, the French New Wave, and the New Hollywood movement, V-cinema's renaissance wasn't jump-started by a small slate of films being released in fairly quick order by a handful of creatives. The seeds for the niche's revitalization in the early 2000s, and its recognition today as an insanely unique form of movie making, began all the way back in 1985, predating the very concept of V-cinema, with a little splatter horror film franchise called Guinea Pig. The term Splatterpunk was coined in the mid-1980s to describe a burgeoning style of literary fiction, works that rebelled against the traditional creeping notions of terror, employing plots and scenarios, exploiting extreme violence and excessive gore. That isn't to say there weren't progenitors of extreme horror in Japan prior to this period, but splatterpunk movies really didn't take off until after 1985, when the first two installments of the direct-to-video horror series, Guinea Pig, hit store shelves and became a surprise success. The videos immediately encountered controversy and censorship over their convincing special effects and disturbing narrative content, as both films roughly added up to just under a collected 90 minutes of women being tortured and killed with little else. While there had been direct-to-video horror films produced before and during this time, there wasn't much else on the video market that rivaled the first two guinea pig films for their relative brutality, but that couldn't be said of many similar movies being released in the rest of the world. While splatter movies had been slowly cultivating a sizable market in several countries since the 1960s, credited largely with the overnight success of American director Herschel Gordon Lewis's first forays into exploitation horror, the early 1980s saw an international explosion of extreme movies and movie makers. Their success, in large part due to their dissemination through legitimate and illegal home video markets, was only equaled by the controversy they generated, which was usually by design. Directors like Lucio Fulci, Sam Raimi, Ruggiero Deodato, and David Cronenberg had inadvertently set the tone for the extreme horror films boom of the 1980s, who, more often than not, found their true home in the video market. This likewise would incite a wave of censorship and hysteria surrounding violence and sex in motion pictures. It is debatable whether or not the burgeoning Japanese horror video landscape was influenced by this incredible uptick in extreme cinema, but it's hard to deny the success of the guinea pig films wasn't mirroring this increasing demand for the darker alleyways of movie making. By the time that V-cinema was officially unleashed on the world, splatter cinema in both live action and animation were being released with regularity to the public, though they wouldn't catch up to the popularity and profitability of the crime hunter action clones until the late 1990s. But the movie that would throw the evolution of fringe horror into eventual overdrive was Shinya Tsukamoto's 1989 debut feature, Tetsuo the Iron Man. This cyberpunk fever dream of body horror and existential dread is regularly noted along Kachiro Otomo's Akira for being one of the films which drew international attention and discourse back to Japanese film, due in part to its acceptance into several notable international film festivals and its popularity with non-Japanese audiences. Though I'd like to note, this qualification grossly underrepresents the work numerous advocates had undertaken to get Japanese film recognized for its contributions beyond the often described golden era of the mid-50s and 60s. This perspective also ignores the domestic appraisal that more recent Japanese films had secured from its public and critics, but it was beyond debate that Tetsuo hit the right chord at exactly the right time. It's still renowned for its exploration of dark and sickly aspects of the human psyche, standing out as one of Japan's most lauded horror movies. But its experiments with narrative structure and technical form, while utilizing exploitation cinema tropes, is what helped to bridge the gap between the art house and V-cinema crowds. As a result, Tetsuo's success ensured horror produced for the V-cinema audience increasingly included an emphasis on body transformation, extreme levels of practical special effects, and plot lines which often combined the mundane with the impossible and absurd. As Splatterpunk entries slowly increased in volume as the years trickled by, its development was matched, almost beat for beat, by a dramatically different yet similar brand of V-cinema horror, The Creeping Terror. Yes, that is the title of the 1964 horror sci-fi flick riffed by MST3K, but here, I find the descriptor is actually apt. These atmospheric productions weren't concerned about providing extreme scenarios of visceral violence, but creating narratives to settle a chill into your spine rather than nausea in your gut. Sure, this approach was largely populated with eerie ghost stories, which have existed in motion pictures since multiple exposure was first used. So if we tried to trace the evolution of the ghost story in Japanese film, we'd be here all damn day. But to understand why this diametric opposition to splatterpunk also gained traction seemingly at the same time, you have to understand that one of the key moments in Japanese history that served as a large motivator for a lot of V-cinema turning away from splatterpunk in the early 1990s was the criminal case of Tsutomu Miyazaki, nicknamed the Otaku Murderer. Miyazaki was a serial killer and necrophile who murdered 4 young girls between 1988 and 1989, and his subsequent trial lasted a staggering 7 years, all the while his actions and habits were heavily rotated through the growing 24/7 news cycle. A search of his home had yielded over 5,700 videotapes, which included pornography, anime, slasher films, and even the guinea pig franchise, which was used by the prosecution and the media as a framework for how Miyazaki's motivations for the killings manifested. Subsequently, the fan bases for adult anime and horror became increasingly ostracized and demonized by the wider Japanese community, and even in the moment when advances in both live-action horror and anime were starting to be recognized and consumed on the world stage, the culture took a major step backwards. So, as action flicks and sex comedies grew in popularity and dissemination within V cinema, splatterpunk movies wouldn't start to decisively develop as a subgenre until the dawn of the next millennium. In their place, the creeping terror started to flourish first, at least comparatively. Movie makers working within this space didn't have much initial hope for widespread recognition, let alone financial advancement or professional stability, regardless of what Tetsuo and Akira had afforded them. As the economic crisis worsened and the public attitude became increasingly negative, the directors, writers, producers, and actors of V-cinema horror had to often extend into tangential genres like Yakuza movies and pink films to secure work, as fairly few of those working in V-cinema actually received royalties or residuals off their movies when they were sold to stores. Much like today, it was structured as a loosely knit gig economy where the only people making consistent money were the studio executives who hired the crews. But in this turmoil, where the ups and downs seemed to match each other in intensity, the fairly loose parameters by which a lot of these movie makers could construct horror films allowed a mounting sense of creative freedom not often achieved. As if taking a page from the nature of Tetsuo, the creators were openly experimenting with the form and function of their projects without worrying about the typical overhead of studio stressors. These borderline trial runs testing audience expectations did little to sway the public opinion back in horror's favor. That was until 1997 when Kiyoshi Kurosawa wrote and directed his psychological thriller, Cure. Kurosawa had already been established as a director in the early 1980s and had helmed a string of flops before finding a home in V-cinema, making a reputation for himself through several projects, but most namely the 6 installments of the Suit Yourself or Shoot Yourself crime franchise. But Cure was a film that, much like Tetsuo, combined classic V-cinema themes with art house aesthetics, but in a very different direction. It's a serial killer film that refuses to play into common tropes that usually wind up in these stories as overtly bloody or grotesque instances. Instead, it opts for unsettling its audience through a steady and deliberate pace punctuated by moments of violence or unnerving revelations. But instead of being an explosion of kineticism that revels in excess, it possesses a clinical perspective that methodically dissects its characters and themes. As a result of the successful blending of these supposed high art and low art worlds, Kurosawa was able to take this film abroad to film festivals and foreign film markets. While this further solidified the attraction of Japanese cinema on the world stage, he was able to play into his current experiences as a V-cinema powerhouse and inject some much needed domestic confidence back into the horror subgenre. As a result, the next few years would see some of the most successful and influential examples of V-cinema being released to the public, led by the likes of Hideo Nakata's Ringu, Takashi Miike's Audition, Takashi Shimizu's Ju-on series, and Kurosawa's own techno horror film, Pulse. These slow-burn narratives, which crescendoed with moments of unsettling imagery or abrupt doses of violence, came to dominate the discourse and appreciation of what would be called J-horror moving into the aughts. It would be highly selective and inaccurate to state that these select movies were the only key defining aspects of J-horror persisting into the present day, just as this would be inaccurate when speaking about any country's genre filmmaking, especially in the direct-to-video market. But it is still accurate to state that V-cinema fundamentally changed, in part due to the success of these projects. Sure, the domestic market was, at any time, brimming with low-budget, low-brow exploitation still engineered to appeal to the time-shifting crowds of the videotape generation. But what production studios large and small were now realizing was that simple saturation wasn't enough to guarantee longevity of the market and their places in it. Focus was shifting from moment-to-moment trend chasing to a more deliberate investment of time and resources to bridge the gap between V-cinema and the prestige and mainstream movies regularly being released in the theaters. As a result, these V-cinema-esque movies weren't being solely relegated for the home video market. All of these breakout movies attributed in making J-horror a worldwide phenomena were being released in the theaters, sometimes taking in multi-million-dollar profits, and were being given exposure and added clout via write-ups by established voices in film criticism and education, both domestic and international. Exposure overseas gave studios and filmmakers unlikely fan bases that could be further leveraged if subsequent efforts didn't manage to catch the attention of homegrown fans, as well as an assumed pedigree that would set the tone and expectation for the medium moving into the following decades. Many voices in the West point to the international success of V-cinema creators like Nakata and Miike as the catalyst for this major shift in how Japanese genre movies would be approached moving into the aughts and the 2010s, but it isn't that simple. While it is true that filmmakers, young and old, were breaking through the glass ceiling of the direct-to-video niche to make major studio films, or to return to making studio films as the case may be, it wasn't just because they had turned a page creatively and graduated from V-cinema to become modern-day auteurs. The near-ruthless production cycle in V-cinema had not only cultivated an insatiable work ethic in many of these movie makers, but many would continue to retain their impressive output and range when moving into major films. Miike in particular has built a reputation for relentlessly releasing multiple projects almost every year since the early 90s for film, video, or television in seemingly every genre under the sun, from horror to westerns, movies about the Yakuza and Wandering Ronin, and even a demented musical. And while many of Miike's contemporaries haven't enjoyed the same level of international fame and discourse surrounding their works, many, like Nakata and Kurosawa, possess the same levels of output and range that they cultivated while working in V-cinema. This reputation and consistency would retain these creators in the mind's eye of audiences and professionals in numerous markets, and each subsequent project would add further influence of Japanese film and video on other national film cultures, which includes, but certainly isn't limited to, the United States, Canada, and Hong Kong. But while this new approach of pushing V-cinema creators and approaches into the mainstream was vital in how the niche was evolving, it was videotape turning the page of its own obsolescence that sealed this transformation, and ultimately, the fate of V-cinema itself. With DVDs being introduced in late 1996, the new format quickly started replacing VHS as the preferred means for distributing home releases. While VHS was still being produced as late as the mid-2010s in Asia, it had been mostly supplanted by DVDs as the preferred home release format before the end of the aughts. V-cinema, as it was known, was quickly coming to an end, and many distributors didn't know what to make of the new environment that was now taking shape. But that was before the world was introduced to the new extremity. The new extremity is a moniker given to a specific coterie of movies that started picking up momentum in the early 2000s, starting largely in France before expanding to an international scale. These movies possessed highly transgressive themes and exploitable elements. This often included vicious levels of violence and depictions of graphic sex, sometimes occurring at the same time. But unlike many of their earlier splatterpunk and hardcore counterparts from previous decades, these movies weren't designed with the exploitation market in mind. A mix of conflicting genres, styles, and intellectual intentions, New Extremity films were here to assault your senses and sentimentalities with nihilistic brutality, and entertainment was rarely considered to be of any large importance by the filmmakers. While this movement had some distinction from the American torture porn horror craze of the mid-aughts, which began in earnest with releases of the Saw and Hostel series in 2004 and 2005 respectively, the world couldn't seem to get enough of either movement's uncompromising subject matter and approach. It was almost as if the design philosophy behind the guinea pig films had resurfaced in a roid-induced rage, even though the franchise had concluded over a decade prior. Even while the creeping terror of J-horror had catapulted the country's movies back into the international eye, the landscape seemed to immediately shift, as if the V-cinema market and approach had snuck in and hijacked the global demand for multimedia. While films like Ringu and Ju-on were remade into big-budget mainstream American theatrical releases, which had varying degrees of success and efficacy, the aughts not only saw the return of splatterpunk, but its thrust into the forefront of J-horror. This would cultivate a freakish and disgusting mutation of the subgenre that has continued to dominate corners of the home horror market. Splatterpunk films had always been wild and violent in V-cinema, but the gore-drenched, no-holds-barred body horror and action hybrids of Yoshihiro Nishimura's Tokyo Gore Police and Naoyuki Tomomatsu's Scissor Penis have come to define the bulk of J-horror in the present day. It isn't just reveling in violence as a means of shock and fear like torture porn, or seeking to break down its audiences through brutal excess like The New Extremity. Modern splatterpunk is equal parts extreme cinema and constant self-aware tongue-in-cheek nods to the audience. The filmmakers understand how batshit zany everything is, and they absolutely lean into this fact. From concept to completion, the movies bathe in their blood-drenched absurdist nature while actively lampooning it, going beyond the clear lines of parody and satire to create a modern take on the subgenre that isn't found in any other national cinema. These projects have all the gusto of a teen idol concert being doused in entrails, and fans the world over have come to embrace these outliers in ways that previous generations either refused to or were restricted from doing so. While there are modern V-cinema entries that still possess that rough factory floor polish and production limitations, the online sphere of distribution has made the overhead costs and physical requirements for distribution a rather moot point. Sure, traditional models of revenue and home distribution have dwindled at a rapid pace, making it harder for these kinds of movies to turn a viable profit, but the continued relative low cost of production and their easy exploitative natures always seem to find an audience, whether ironic or not. The movies might not be pulling in the sales figures that had accompanied many early V-cinema videos, but the likes of Nishimura and Tomomatsu, along with other contemporaries like Juniichi Yamamoto and Noboru Iguchi, have taken the identity of V-cinema into the modern era. It might often be labeled as just a new breed of extreme splatterpunk cinema, but often the makers of these projects had their roots in some stage of V-cinema's history. They take these new methods of production and distribution and somehow still manage to retain that early earnestness and over-the-top charm which made these kinds of movies so popular, keeping the spirit and memory of V-cinema very much alive.